Hi, I'm Amy. This adorable little ball of cuteness is my co-host Bill. He is here because he does not know how to behave around strange men with strange hair. Welcome to the beginning of my podcast. This is very exciting because I have been dreaming of doing something like this for years. Just to get this out of the way, I am legally blind. Well, I can still see a little, but it's pretty much useless. Just wanted to get that out of the way because the blindness is literally in the name of the channel and I am not embarrassed by my disability. Anyway, just to be clear, I am not a professional. I am just a uni student who loves history and going on history tangents. This is meant as just a way to introduce you to topics that I find interesting, and I encourage you to do further research if you also find them interesting. If I make any mistakes, please point them out in a polite fashion in the comment section. Reminder, the comment section is to be a place of calm and polite discussion. Thanks to Callan, my support worker who is editing and filming the podcast. He makes this all possible. Thank you. Now that everything is out of the way, let's finally get to the episode. Australia, Britain's dumping ground. Australia, you have just got to love it. Amazing beaches, beautiful landscapes, rare and unique wildlife, which only sometimes wants to kill you. I love my country, but of course, we must not ignore Australia's dark past. A couple centuries ago, Australia was a gathering of colonies under the British Empire and were not a united country until 1901. During the early years, there were issues, such as the climate, which was dramatically different to that of England, violence within the colonies, and of course, conflict with the Aboriginals. The discussion of colonisation period of Australia is a long one and I cannot cover everything. In this episode, I will discuss the initial colony in New South Wales and the joys of first contact with the land and the Aborigines. Then I will discuss an example of frontier violence by examining the disaster that was Tasmania. Finally, I will briefly discuss the founding of a very unique state, South Australia. I encourage you to do any further research if you want to learn more. James Cook first discovered the landmass which would become Australia in 1770 during his voyage of the Pacific. And of course, Britain at this time was much like a 2-year-old. They see something shiny, they say it's theirs. Though admittedly it took until the 1780s to decide what to do with the new land. And what did they decide? They decided it would be the perfect place to send all of their unwanted convicts. See, life was not that great in Britain at the time. Poverty was high and so was the crime. The prisons were full and they couldn't just execute everybody. Britain used to send extra convicts over to America, but then the War of Independence happened. So, when Britain saw this new shiny landmass in the middle of the ocean on the other side of the world, they decided that this would be a great place to set up a few penal colonies. In January of 1788, Governor Phillip and the First Fleet arrived at the spot on the eastern coast that Cook had indicated. This would eventually be known as Botany Bay. However, Philip decided Botany Bay was not inhabitable, so he went north to what will later be known as Sydney Cove. And it is here where the first British penal colony of Australia was established. And it all just gets out of control from here. To begin, let us discuss the most important people on this voyage, the very reason they are there, the convicts. Most convicts were there because of thievery, because everyone was poor back then. They were the laborers of the colony, the ones who did the physical work. Yes, many who are not Australian may criticize us for our convict past, but today many people are actually proud of being descended from convicts. After all, finding a place to empty out the prisons was Britain's original intention for Australia. But let's just be honest. Once they knew some land was there, it was only a matter of time before the British Empire decided to do something with it. But the convicts were not the only people there. They also had officials, marines, and other free settlers whose task it was to build a functioning colony. This was far harder than expected. First of all, it took a while for the first fleet to be followed by a second and third. Food quickly became scarce and starvation was common. Very few of the people who came had experience in farming, and cattle would literally just wander off into the bush. Honestly, if I was planning a colony, I would have prioritized people who could, actually farm the land. But I guess the British Parliament were too busy thinking about how to empty out their prisons. The settlers struggled to identify parts of the natural flora and fauna which were safe to eat. The Aborigines of the area, the Ora people, sorry, I can barely pronounce English, but of course, Brits would not listen. Eventually, more fleets came around and things got easier, but the colonists' inability to function in a completely different ecosystem was the least of their concerns. A more pressing issue were the Aboriginals, the actual owners of the land. And well, this next section is just messy. Australia was once home to hundreds, if not thousands, of Aboriginal tribes. For thousands of years, they had developed a diverse and unique culture of hunter-gatherers who worked with the land. So I can hardly imagine the absolute shock felt by the first Aborigines to see the approaching British settlers. When Governor Phillip and the First Fleet landed at what would become Sydney Harbour, there were two tribes who would have seen them. In the south lived the Camaragal people. As a reminder, I cannot pronounce words. And to the north was the Ora people. When they did arrive, there were, of course, plenty of issues between the settlers and the Aborigines. The British thought their way of living was far superior and the Aborigines should just assimilate. And while the governors and other authority figures claimed the Aboriginals should be treated like citizens of the British Empire and should therefore be subject to the same laws and protections, we will later see that this did not happen in practice. Meanwhile, the Aborigines saw these strange people trying and failing to work with the land, and they were probably thinking, these people don't know what they are doing, do they? They are going to go home soon, right? But the settlers were there to stay. There were those among the Aborigines who tried to negotiate some sort of cultural compromise with the settlers. Bennelong is an example of such a person. He and one other Aborigine were captured in 1789. During his captivity, Bennelong seems to have embraced the settlers. Even after he was released in 1791, he frequently came back to the settlement. They even built a hut for him. The place where his hut stood was later named Bennelong's Point, which is the current location of the Sydney Opera House. Keep that in mind, the Sydney Opera House stands on the ground where once lived an Aboriginal man who basically had Stockholm Syndrome for the British settlers. Unfortunately, this story takes a dark turn. In 1792, Governor Phillip took Bennelong back to England with him, and the man even got to meet King George. In 1795, Bennelong returned, but he could not reconnect with his own people and would die in 1813. While some may have assimilated, or at least tried to, others resisted. For example, Pomeroy, who was a member of the Bindugul clan of the Jurag Nation to the south and west of Sydney Cove. For thousands of years, Australia had developed a very complex and delicate ecosystem, one which the Aboriginals maintained. And then the settlers came and ruined it all. Tribes were forced out of their natural hunting ground, and foreign diseases decimated the population. So, heroes rose to combat this threat. One such hero was Pomeroy. In 1790, he speared Governor Phillip's gamekeeper, and a price was put on the man's head. Pomeroy raided the settlements and stole cattle, doing all he could to resist. He was shot twice in 1801 and yet survived. However, he was eventually killed in 1802, and his head was sent to England because even in the 19th century, heads were apparently trophies. In the next section, we are going to move on from New South Wales and travel to what I consider one of the biggest disasters in Australian history. Yes, even more than the summer of 2020 and the Great Toilet Paper Famine. While there were many settlements in Australia throughout the 19th century, two of the biggest ones were New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, which would later become Tasmania. Van Diemen's Land is what I would consider a perfect example of frontier violence between the settlers and the Aboriginals. In just a few decades, a population of several thousand was reduced to less than 50. In 1803, Van Diemen's Land was settled by Governor Collins. The first few years were hard. The first successful harvest did not come until 1808. Van Diemen's Land became a very violent settlement. This may have been due to many factors: the isolation, the state brutality, the lack of resources. Corporal punishment was very frequent. Even women and children as young as 10 would be imprisoned and whipped. Many convicts who escaped would become bushrangers, who were extremely violent, especially towards the Aboriginals. Now, Collins was told in 1803 that Aborigines are to be afforded protection as citizens of the British Empire. First of all, it took Collins until 1805 to recognize this. And secondly, Collins and succeeding lieutenant governors seem to have a problem with following through. Oh, they did threaten to punish the white settlers for violence against Aborigines, but they rarely followed through. A settler could shoot an Aboriginal and not be punished. They would even steal Aboriginal women and treat them like slaves, which comes with all the disgusting things. By 1826, the Aboriginals had had enough, and they began to fight back with guerrilla warfare. The settlers had already been afraid of the Aborigines and had been dehumanizing them for decades, but this only made things worse. The Aborigines would burn farms, plunder private property, and kill civilians. Their tactics went against the British idea of warfare, and the settlers did not like it. It got to the point there were roving parties of people ready to kill Aboriginals. Governor Arthur even legalized the killing of Aboriginals, because that is an excellent idea. How do we stop all of this violence? Let's make violence legal! Arthur began to incarcerate Aboriginals in 1829. Around 5 out of 6 people would die in captivity. And then, of course, we have Waibelana, located on the west coast of Flinders Island. This was a settlement established in the 1830s, intended to protect the few remaining Aborigines. The living conditions, the food, and the shelter were extremely poor. Their children had been taken away. It was so bad, some have even called it a concentration camp. It got so bad they even petitioned Queen Victoria for help. Eventually, the Secretary of State declared that the remaining Aborigines were to be relocated. In October of 1847, they were located to Oyster Bay. In 1835, there were over 200 Aboriginals sent to Waibelana. By 1847, only 47 left. There is a literal debate of whether or not what happened to the Aboriginals of Tasmania was a genocide. Maybe instead of arguing about what we should call this tragedy, maybe we should be discussing what we can learn from it. This tragedy happened because of cultures clashing. Could there have been other, better ways of handling this situation? Maybe. We will never know, and this is why I believe history is so important. History is a lesson. It is a lesson on what mistakes were made by our ancestors and how we can avoid them. It is terrible that not only could these two cultures not get along, but that their interaction resulted in such a tragedy. We should not be looking back and asking, was this genocide? Because calling it one thing or another won't change what happened. We should look forward and ask ourselves, what can we do to avoid the mistakes of the past? In 100 years, 200 years, our descendants are probably going to look at us and think, what the hell were they doing? After that emotionally charged section, I want to finish on a lighter note. Let's briefly talk about a rather unique state, South Australia. This state has a very different beginning to the rest. You see, South Australia never had any convicts. It was a completely free settlement. The original idea for South Australia was made in 1834 by Edward Gibbon Wakefield, who was in Newgate prison for abducting a schoolgirl. Yeah, the irony is not lost on me. Moving on, the location for the planned colony was scouted by Colonel William Light. He originally landed on Kangaroo Island, but he quickly realized this was not going to work. So he moved to Holdfast Bay, which would later become Glenelg. And let me tell you, Glenelg is such a beautiful beach. And there's even a museum discussing the colonial period, and it's so awesome because it has floorboards, and I love floorboards and learning about history. Anyway, even before Light could decide the location of the city, the settlers were landing. because apparently they were excited to come to Australia before, air conditioning, showers, and deodorant. Eventually, Light decided to plan the city around the River Torrens. Light's design of 2 rectangles on the south and north side, along with the many parklands, are highly regarded. Adelaide is one of the few cities whose borders have rarely, if ever, changed, and that's awesome. Yes, Adelaide may not be as big as other cities in the world, but I still love it. The Central Market, the Botanic Gardens, the Festival Theatre, they all make Adelaide a place worth visiting. Anyway, South Australia was originally designed to make profit, and that it did. They started selling land to people in the colony and in London. Never mind that they really didn't have the right to sell anything. There were some problems. Light had some arguments with Governor Hindmarsh over the location of the city, but overall, South Australia succeeded, even with the absence of convicts. Australia has a violent past. I accept that. We were originally a dumping ground for British convicts. We had conflict with the Aboriginals, which escalated into literal genocide. But we have grown from our violent past and turned into a beautiful country. I highly recommend you do further research into the colonial period, as it is not only interesting, but important to know. How else do we avoid such violence unless we acknowledge it and try to not repeat the mistakes of our ancestors? In the past, we let the differences in our cultures divide us, but now maybe we should try and learn from each other to build a better future, so 200 years from now, our descendants won't look back and question our actions. Thanks for watching. It has been an honest pleasure. I hope to see you next fortnight. And until then, keep an open mind and don't take other people's stuff. Oh, and for anyone who thinks us Australians ride kangaroos to work, you are so wrong. Everyone knows it's emus.